My name is Stephen Knight, and I'm going to be giving you a brief presentation on the evolution of supercomputers. So, for the sake of time, I'm going to simplify examples and definitions as best as I can to, again, keep this going forward. Before we start, does anybody have an idea of what the definition for a supercomputer is? Go ahead, Ben.
It's a computer that normally has blades or many computers in it that all work to accomplish one goal.
That is a description of a supercomputer. The Webster's Dictionary definition of a supercomputer is a very large mainframe computer with the sole purpose of scientific computations. Unfortunately, that's wrong because there is a difference between mainframes and supercomputers. Does anybody have a guess on what that difference could be? Nope. Okay. Typically, mainframes are used in businesses for transactions. They are used for large scales of the same thing. So, insurances, things like that, where you have to do the exact same thing multiple times very fast. That's what a mainframe would be used for, whereas supercomputers would be used to process one problem very precisely for a long time. So, going into it, we're going to go ahead and start with the IBM Nordic. While it's not technically a supercomputer in the eyes of the world, it could be argued that it was because its main focus was to be the fastest I don't know how to say what the term for it is, but it was supposed to be the fastest calculator in the world at the time, and to surpass all other calculators in its field, and to do this with speed and reliability. This would later become the definition that supercomputers would use for over half a century in their own method of becoming the fastest supercomputer while also doing that with speed and reliability. Moving on to the next one. The CDC 6600 would be the first computer to coin the term supercomputer. What made this special is that it was the first computer to use a transistor-based system, while also being the first computer to use a reduced set of instructions. This means that instead of being CPU-based while having the CPU do everything, it pushed it to the smaller processors to offset its workload. That way, it can use more of its power to do processing. This would later become called the RISC design, so RISC design. Just before the 6600 was released, the Atlas computer was announced. Unfortunately, they were vying for supercomputer at the time, and the Atlas coming out second didn't get the title of the first supercomputer. But it would technically be the computer that started what we today know as computers, meaning that it was the first computer not only to use a CPU and RISC-based system, but also the first computer to use virtual memory to offset its own workload. With me so far, guys? Okay. Okay, so moving on to the 70s. The Cray 1 became the first computer to implement a vector processor design. Anybody have an idea on what a vector processor is? Okay. Normal CPUs, or scalier CPUs, implement a process of find the number, find the next number, add the numbers together, repeat step one. What vector computers did is instead of going that route, they would find numbers 1 through 10, find another set of 1 through 10, add those together, meaning that it can do large sums of data very fast in comparison to scalier CPUs at the time. once this computer came out, no other computer actually could keep up with the advancements that it made until the Cray 2 came out. Now, the Cray 2 was the first computer to use multiple CPUs in its design. It hosted up to 8 CPUs on its board, and made its making it run up to 12 times faster than the original Cray 1. This could also be considered one of the first immersion builds ever, as, and it's not pictured here, it was off to the right a little bit, but the actual memory units for the computer were immersed in M3, an M3 liquid. So skipping ahead another decade is where, instead of looking at changing the mechanics or internal components of the computers, we looked at how they were actually built. The cost became so great to make proprietary technologies that we started looking at buying stuff off the shelves. And that's when the Hesse Web came out. The Hesse Web was the first supercomputer to actually use off-the-shelf parts instead of using proprietary parts to achieve its supercomputer status and being the top of the list. Anybody have an idea of what part it used? Mid-90s. It would use the Pentium Pro, and yeah, was one of the things that made the Pentium Pro, the Pentium line, successful, is that this computer is what used it. Moving on to the next one, the IBM Roadrunner was the first computer to reach the petaflop status of computation. When dealing with normal computers, we typically use instructions per minute, not minute, per second. Supercomputers don't operate in instructions. They're used in calculations. So flops are floating point calculations per second. And a peta is 10 to the 18th power. So it's calculating at 10 to the 18th power per second in calculations. And it did this by hybridizing the RISC design used in the CDC 6600. Lastly, we have Summit. And we're skipping quite a bit to get to Summit. Again, a lot of the technologies aren't too impressive to make them warrant the list. But Summit became the fastest because it not only used the previous technologies, but it also perfected parallel processing as opposed to some of the older ones. Parallel processing is similar to RISC, where it offsets the workload of the main CPU by using other CPUs, other processors, but Summit does that by offsetting it with upwards of 100 microprocessors in its place. So instead of using a few to offset the workload, once it hit so many, it became accelerators as opposed to just helpers, meaning that the main processor is actually getting boosted off of the speed. And that's my brief presentation. Do y'all have any questions? What's up, Ben?
Did you look at any of the new supercomputers that were coming out in 2019? Like some of the ones that were going to be powered by AMD's new processors and graphics cards?
I believe Frontier is going AMD, but the only two that I know were Frontier, and I believe it's the TH3 that China's working on. But both of those are trying to, instead of go for petaflop, both of those are pushing for exaflop to help with the, I think it's called the Big Brain Project. They're trying to match the natural process for the human brain. The neutral, sorry, not natural, the neutral process, not functional neutral. What's up, Wesley?
How much is a flop?
How much is a flop? Just a singular flop? I actually couldn't tell you that, just because it's used as the term. It's asking like how much is an instruction per second. Without the beginning, you can't calculate it.
How much is
Huh?
it's kind of like how much is a penny?
Well,
You need something to compare it to.
well, yeah, you need something to compare to, yeah. So.
All right.
Well, thank you guys. That was